Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Katherine Howard and Catherine Parr. 6 very different women, all with one thing in common. They all married the same man. In today's video from History Calling, I give you the story of the 6 wives of Henry VIII, from the birth of the eldest, the Spanish Princess Catherine, in 1485, to the death of Anne of Cleves in 1557, as she was the last of his spouses to pass. It's a story filled with love, betrayal, adultery and tragedy, with accusations of treason and incest and the judicial murder of 2 of the women. This video is designed as an overview of their story, ideal for those of you who like your history bite-sized or who just want a quick refresh or even introduction to this story. If it leaves you wanting more, however, do also check out my 6 Wives playlist, which I'll leave linked on screen and below for you, and which is full of videos taking an in-depth look at each of these ladies. Make sure you stay till the end as well, and I'll also tell you which of the women is my favourite to learn about and which I think I'd get along best with. Before we get to that though, I'm thrilled to be able to thank History Hit for sponsoring this video. History Hit is like Netflix, but all history. It brings you the stories that have shaped our world through an award-winning podcast network and an online history channel. You can watch hundreds of hours of original history documentaries featuring expert historians such as Dan Snow, Professor Susanna Lipscomb and Dan Jones, and you can access them anywhere, anytime and on any device. As well as its hundreds of expert-led programs, History Hit adds 2 more every week. It also launches 19 new episodes weekly across 8 podcasts, including on the world's leading history podcast, Dan Snow's History Hit. I've recently been watching their documentary Ham House, which is part of a series on Great British Houses. In this programme, Alice Loxton looks at this spectacular Stuart mansion gifted by Charles I to the Murray family in 1626, and tells its story from the 1630s through to the English Civil War, when parliamentarians threatened to seize it, the interregnum, and into the reign of Charles II. It includes the tale of one of the Murray daughters who might have been a royalist informer and spy, and affords a look at a remarkable strongbox full of hidden compartments. To gain access to this show, along with the rest of the Great British Houses series and History Hit's huge array of other programmes, click the link in the description box below, which will take you to their subscribe page. You can also get a fantastic 50% off your first 3 months when you select the monthly option and use the code HISTORYCALLING at checkout. Once again, thank you to History Hit for sponsoring this video. And now, let's hear more about the 6 wives of Henry VIII. Our story starts in Spain at the Archbishop of Toledo's palace at Alcalá de Henares on the 16th of December 1485, when a little girl called Catalina was born to King Ferdinand of Aragon and his wife, Queen Isabella of Castile, a 15th century power couple known jointly as the Catholic Kings. Their daughter, whose name once anglicised became Catherine of Aragon, would grow up to play an instrumental role in the history of England. As early as 1488, plans were afoot to marry her to the heir to the English throne, Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, and in November 1501 these plans came to fruition when Catherine arrived in England and was married to her prince at St. Paul's Cathedral. Less than 5 months later, however, tragedy struck. Arthur died at Ludlow Castle of an unknown ailment, though if you see my video on his death it discusses some of the possible diagnoses, and Catherine was left the Dowager Princess of Wales. Her parents and her father-in-law, Henry VII, quickly looked to remarry her to Arthur's younger brother, Prince Henry. But wrangling over the girl's dowry meant that this marriage did not occur before King Henry's death in April 1509. At that point, though, Catherine's fortunes changed yet again. The new King Henry VIII, aged just 17, quickly married his one-time sister-in-law on the 11th of June and received a papal dispensation enabling him to do so despite their prior relationship, and the couple were crowned together on the 24th of June. Catherine quickly became pregnant, but tragically suffered a miscarriage in January 1510, though her doctors mistakenly thought she'd been carrying twins and convinced her that the pregnancy was continuing, leading to considerable embarrassment when everyone realised that it was not. Fortunately, Catherine did then conceive, and on the 1st of January 1511 she was delivered of a healthy baby boy, named Henry after his father. It was perhaps the highlight of her life. She'd achieved the primary goal of a 16th century queen and produced a male heir for her husband. Sadly, her joy wasn't to last. Little Henry died after less than 8 weeks of life, and over the next 8 years, Catherine lost nearly all of her children, save for her daughter, Princess Mary, born in 1516. King Henry was not faithful to her either, and even produced an illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, in 1519, whose mother was Bessie Blunt, one of Catherine's ladies-in-waiting. There was more to Catherine's queenship than pregnancy, loss, and her husband's wandering eye, however. Henry left her as Regent of England in 1513 when he went campaigning in France, and while he was gone, the Scots invaded, and Catherine managed the response, even sending her husband the blood-stained coat of their now-deceased brother-in-law, James IV of Scotland, who had been married to Henry's sister Margaret and who died at the Battle of Flodden on the 9th of September, as a trophy of England's victory. She was also a devoted mother to Mary, even correcting the girls' Latin exercises for her during the princess's early education, and taking delight in Mary's betrothal in 1521 to Catherine's nephew, Charles V of Spain, though this was abandoned in 1525 when Charles decided to marry Isabella of Portugal, which he duly did the following year. By that point, it was evident that Catherine was past childbearing age, having not given birth since 1518, and Henry was increasingly concerned about the succession. He had advanced Henry Fitzroy as far as he could, given the boy's illegitimate status, and tried to make the best possible marriage alliance for Mary. But neither a boy born out of wedlock nor a girl born within it were considered good choices for a future monarch. It was at around this time that the king began to take a romantic interest in another of Catherine's ladies, a young woman named Anne Boleyn. Anne was born in around 1501. Some people say 1507, but I have a whole video on why I think it was 1501. And she was the daughter of Sir Thomas Boleyn, later Earl of Wiltshire and Ormond, and Lady Elizabeth Howard. After growing up at her family's home, Windsor Castle, she was sent first to the court of Margaret of Austria in 1513 to finish her education, and then, quite quickly, from there to the French court, where she was briefly a lady-in-waiting to Henry VIII's sister, Mary Tudor, not to be confused with his daughter of the same name, who hadn't actually been born yet, when she was briefly Queen of France at the end of 1514. When Mary's husband, Louis XII, died on New Year's Day 1515, she returned to England with her new husband, Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, but Anne remained in France to serve the new French Queen, Claude. She would not set foot in England again until late 1521, when there were plans afoot to marry her off to her Irish cousin, James Butler. And this is a picture of James, by the way. It's not Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, who it is sometimes incorrectly identified as. These marriage plans ultimately came to nothing, as did Anne's later relationship with Henry Percy, who was then heir to the Earl of Northumberland. Despite later attempts to show otherwise, these two were never betrothed or secretly married. Her first recorded court appearance was at a dance in 1522, and it is therefore evident that Henry had known her for years, at least as a background figure in his wife's household, before they became romantically involved. In the meantime, he had also had some sort of a fling or affair with her sister, Mary Boleyn, though we don't know when this occurred or for how long it lasted. By the late 1520s, though, he only had eyes for Anne, and was seeking an annulment of his marriage to Catherine, which he fully expected his top minister, Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, to obtain for him. Henry argued that the Bible said that a man should not marry his brother's widow, or they would be childless, which he conveniently interpreted as being without a living son, and that the Pope did not have the power to dispense with such an impediment. In fact, his argument was clearly inaccurate. For the Bible says a man shouldn't sleep with his brother's wife, but that he should marry and care for his brother's widow, just as Henry had done. Catherine fought her husband's attempts to abandon her valiantly, and she held up his plans for years, even embarrassing him publicly by going down on her knees in front of him when a legatine court was convened at Blackfriars to sit in judgment on their marriage in June 1529, and swearing that she and Arthur had never sealed the deal, as it were, which would have meant that their marriage was not fully valid. Wolsey was unable to obtain the annulment, leading to a fall from grace which may well have ended with his head on a block had he not died of natural causes first in 1530. Even without him, Henry remained determined to have his way, and he was ruthless when it came to getting it. Unable to beat Catherine in a court of law, in July 1531 he ordered her away from the royal court, forbade her from seeing their daughter ever again, though they exchanged secret letters, and had Anne effectively treated as queen consort. Having perhaps learnt from her sister's experience, though, Anne refused to become Henry's mistress and held out for marriage. Catherine's nephew, Charles V, had the Pope in his power by this point, though, and no papal annulment of the Aragon marriage was forthcoming. In September 1532, Henry created Anne the Lady Marquess, we would say Marchioness, of Pembroke in her own right, just before he took her with him on a diplomatic journey to France. There were rumours that they went through some sort of marriage ceremony in November when they returned, and certainly they had finally begun sleeping together, as Anne was pregnant by early December. There seems to have been a secret marriage ceremony on the 25th of January 1533, and with time now of the essence, and believing himself to be sole master of his own realm and its laws, Henry split from the church in Rome, and in May had his Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declare the Aragon marriage void and the Boleyn marriage valid. Catherine was demoted to Princess Dowager of Wales, and Anne was crowned queen at Westminster Abbey on the 1st of June. She was at the zenith of her power. On the 7th of September, though, she gave birth to what would be her only surviving child, and unfortunately for her, it was a daughter, Princess Elizabeth. The King and Queen put a brave face on this, but there can be no doubt that their daughter's gender was a severe disappointment. The letters announcing her birth had been prepared in advance and had initially said they had welcomed a prince. An extra S had to be hastily inserted to make the word princess. Only one S was needed to do this, by the way, due to the vagaries of 16th century spelling. Henry and Anne still seemed very much in love, though, and by the end of the year, the Queen was pregnant once again. This pregnancy ended in the summer of 1534, however, and Anne's miscarriage or stillbirth was kept so quiet that we don't know exactly what happened or when. Just as he had been unfaithful to Catherine, so Henry was also now cheating on Anne, including with her cousin Madge Shelton. All could have been salvaged, though, if only Anne had been able to have a living boy. It was October 1535 before she conceived again, though, and while this child was indeed male, Anne lost the pregnancy on the 29th of January 1536 when she was only 15 weeks along, and on the very day that Catherine of Aragon was buried in Peterborough Cathedral, having died on the 7th of January at Kimbolton Castle, possibly of heart cancer, and still professing her love for and devotion to Henry. The countdown was now on to Anne's own death. Her lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, had caught the king's eye, and he was rapidly falling out of love with his second wife, who also had a difficult relationship with his top minister, Thomas Cromwell. On the 2nd of May, Anne was arrested, taken to the Tower of London, and charged with adultery with 5 men, including her brother George, and with treason for having supposedly imagined the king's death, which, in an unguarded moment with one of her co-accused, she had inadvertently done so by saying the man hoped to marry her if anything happened to the king. All were found guilty of the charges, and Anne's co-accused were executed on Tower Hill on the 17th of May. On the same day, Henry had Cranmer annul their union, apparently on the grounds of his affair with her sister, and declared their daughter illegitimate. Then, on the 19th of May, the former queen went to her death as well. She was executed within the grounds of the Tower, next to the entrance to the modern jewel house, and by a French swordsman specially sent for so that she wouldn't have to suffer the more gruesome death by axe. Her body was placed in an arrow chest, no coffin having been provided, and she was buried next to her brother George in the nearby chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. Henry now moved on to wife number 3. Jane Seymour had been born in around 1508 or 1509 and had previously been a lady-in-waiting to both Catherine of Aragon and, as we've heard, Anne Boleyn, having arrived at court in around 1529. We know very little about her youth, however, because frankly, much like Anne Boleyn, she just wasn't deemed very important by contemporaries until Henry decided he liked the look of her. Their affair seems to have begun in late 1535 or early 1536, and soon the king was showering her with money and gifts, including a necklace with his picture in it, which a furious Anne tore from around Jane's neck when she saw her wearing it. Jane had taken a leaf from her mistress's playbook, however. She refused to succumb to Henry's advances, even sending back a letter and purse of money he sent her on one occasion, and held out for marriage, though Anne did still walk in on her sitting on Henry's lap one day. Whether she anticipated just how far he would go to be rid of his second queen is anyone's guess, but the two were engaged the day after Anne's death and married on the 30th of May at Whitehall Palace. Jane's time as queen was to prove even shorter than her predecessors. She helped to reconcile Henry with his two daughters, but her main contribution to the royal family was her success at becoming pregnant at the start of 1537. On the 12th of October that year, she was delivered of a healthy baby boy named Edward, but sadly this was to be her undoing. Within days she fell ill from childbed complications, and on the 24th of October she died at Hampton Court Palace. Henry seemed genuinely forlorn for a time, Jane being the only wife who ever left him rather than the other way around, and he gave her a lavish and expensive funeral before having her buried in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Grief notwithstanding, however, the hunt was soon on for wife number 4. Several candidates were suggested as possible new queens of England, including Christina of Denmark, Dowager Duchess of Milan, about whom I already have a video. It was on the German princess, Anne of Cleves, that Henry finally settled, however. Born in 1515, the 24-year-old Anne had led a closeted life, closely guarded by her mother, and given what was, by 16th century royal standards, only a rudimentary education, and one which did little to prepare her for life at the English court. She spoke only German, didn't dance or sing, had no schooling in courtly manners, and was most interested in her needlework. In 1527, there were plans to marry her to Francois, the son of the Duke of Lorraine, but despite rumbling on for over a decade, these plans never came to anything, and the pair never even met. Francois went on to marry Christina of Milan, by the way. This left Anne free to be snapped up by Henry. She arrived in England at the end of December 1539, and when Henry met her for the first time at Rochester on the 1st of January 1540, appearing to her in disguise, Anne didn't cotton on to who he was, and basically ignored him. The king's fragile ego was wounded, and he frantically tried to find some legal loophole to get him out of the marriage. When Thomas Cromwell was unable to provide one, Henry had to go through with the ceremony on the 6th. His dislike of his new wife only increased, though, and he insulted her body and said he couldn't bring himself to sleep with her. He also, surprise, surprise, decided that the person he should be with was one of her ladies-in-waiting, Mistress Katherine Howard, who also happened to be a first cousin of Anne Boleyn. After only 6 months of marriage, Henry once again obtained an annulment, though in this case that annulment would likely be considered valid in England even today, as it appears the two really didn't ever consummate their union, which was one of the reasons given for it. Anne wisely agreed to the king's wishes, and she was handsomely compensated with a fortune in money, houses, and goods. She wasn't allowed to leave England, presumably because Henry didn't want her bad-mouthing him across Europe, but she was given the honorary title of the king's sister, and the only women in the land who outranked her were his wife and daughters. She retired to her houses, which included the Boleyn's old family home, Windsor Castle, and lived a mostly quiet life thereafter. Of all Henry's wives, she was probably the luckiest in terms of her fate. Her successor, however, is the greatest tragedy of today's story. Katherine Howard was most likely born between 1521 and 1523, and was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, who was Anne Boleyn's maternal uncle, and his wife Jocasta Culpeper. Her mother died when she was very small, and her father remarried twice, but Catherine was brought up primarily at the home of her step-grandmother, Agnes Tilney, Dowager Duchess of Norfolk. Whilst there, she and her music teacher, Henry Mannix, became romantically involved, and she also had a more serious relationship with a man named Francis Derham, who even referred to her as his wife, though they were never betrothed or married. In late 1539, she was given a place in the household of Anne of Cleves, and as I mentioned a minute ago, she very soon came to the attention of the king. By the 24th of April 1540, she was being granted royal gifts, specifically the possessions of 2 murderers, which isn't very romantic, but then again, nothing about Catherine's life was, in my opinion. Queen Anne could see her husband's attraction to her young lady-in-waiting by June, but it was too late to salvage the Cleves marriage. Anne was sent away from court, and once the marriage was annulled, Catherine wed Henry on the 28th of July. Henry evidently doted on his teen queen and showered her with gifts and money, though his daughter Mary was less fond of her new stepmother, who was after all several years younger than her, and the two had a tricky relationship, with Catherine complaining that Mary didn't show her sufficient respect. With Princess Elizabeth, relations seem to have been better, and Catherine gave the little girl some inexpensive gifts of jewellery. She even maintained cordial relations with Anne of Cleves, dancing with the former queen at the court celebrations for Christmas in 1540. The new queen kept details of her previous liaisons with Manox and Derham secret, however, and this information, along with her relationship with a distant relative, Thomas Culpeper, would come back to haunt her. Derham, who had been away in Ireland, suddenly showed up at court wanting favours and making indiscreet comments about his relationship with the Queen, and Culpeper, who already had a court position and had a very bad reputation as a man who had been violent towards women in the past, began to visit her in her chambers, with their meetings facilitated by Catherine's lady-in-waiting, Jane Boleyn, Dowager Viscountess Rochford, the widow of Catherine's cousin, George Boleyn. Whether Catherine was romantically involved with Culpeper is unclear. A letter she wrote to him, in which she expressed concern for his health and told him she was his as long as life endured, has been read by many as an indication that she was. But some historians have instead posited that he was, quote, an aggressive, dangerous suitor, to use Retha Warnick's phrase, and that Catherine met up with him only to try to appease him and stop him spreading details of her relationship with Francis Derham. Meanwhile, she tried to bribe Derham too to stay quiet, and even gave him a position in her household. She was only digging herself into an even deeper hole, however. On the 2nd of November 1541, Henry was informed about her premarital behaviour, and on the 6th of November he left her, never to see her again. Catherine was interrogated by Thomas Cranmer, and in extreme distress, she eventually claimed that she was very young when the indiscretion with Manox had occurred, bear in mind that she was probably still no more than 20 even at this point, and that Derham had been the pursuer in her relationship with him. Under torture, Derham alerted the investigators to her relationship with Culpeper, but she denied ever having committed adultery against the king. Culpeper denied it too, by the way, and begged for mercy. Henry showed her none. Her male accomplices were imprisoned, as were she and Jane Lady Rochford. Catherine was sent to Sion Abbey on the 14th of November, and on the 22nd she was stripped of her title as queen. Culpeper and Derham were both convicted of treason and executed in December, and some of Catherine's relatives who had known of her past, including the Duchess of Norfolk, were indicted for treason too, but all were eventually pardoned. Not so for Catherine. She and Viscountess Rochford were condemned by Bill of Attainder on the 21st of January 1542 for having committed high treason, and Henry gave his assent to this bill on the 11th of February. The day before, Catherine had been brought by water to the Tower of London, where, on the 13th, she and Jane were executed one after the other and buried next to Anne and George Boleyn in the chapel of St. Peter at Vincula. Henry now had a break from married life, and it was well over a year later when he embarked on his final union. This was with the twice-widowed Catherine Parr, then known as Lady Latimer, who he wed on the 12th of July 1543 at Hampton Court Palace. Born in around 1512, Catherine Parr was well educated and spoke French, Latin and Italian as well as her native English. She married her first husband, Edward Burgh, in about 1529, aged 17, but he died in early 1533 or thereabouts. She wed her second, John Neville, Baron Latimer, in 1534, but we have no record of any pregnancies on her part during either of these marriages. Latimer died on the 2nd of March 1543, by which point Catherine was employed in the household of Princess Mary. She had hoped to marry Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Queen Jane, but when the king expressed an interest in her, she felt obliged to marry him, telling Seymour that she felt it was God's will that she do so. Contrary to portrayals of her in some movies and TV shows, she was not brought in as a nursemaid to the aging king. Monarchs do have servants for that kind of thing after all, and was in fact likely a little younger than Anne Boleyn had been when she married Henry back in 1533, and evidently quite beautiful, though Anne of Cleves, who seems to have cherished some hopes that Henry might take her back, grumbled that she felt she was the better looking of the two. Catherine Parr got along well with her new royal stepchildren, taking a particular interest in the education of Prince Edward and Princess Elizabeth, and she was the first of Henry's wives since Catherine of Aragon, who was left as regent of his kingdom when he again went off campaigning in France in the summer of 1544. Princess Elizabeth was at court during this time, and it has been speculated that her experience of seeing her stepmother rule so effectively influenced her own attitudes to queenship in later life. Like Anne Boleyn, Catherine had been raised a Catholic, but at some point had turned to the Reformed religion, and she is remarkable as the first woman in English history to publish an English language book of her own authorship and under her own name in that country. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given her interests, its theme was religion. Having already dipped her toe into the world of translations, this first sole-authored work was entitled Prayers or Meditations and came out in May 1545. Her stepdaughter Elizabeth translated it into several different languages as a New Year's gift for her father at the end of that year, and you can see the cover of that book here. Catherine's second work, Lamentations of a Sinner, came out in 1547, though you're looking at a title page from the 1548 edition here. Her religious beliefs and her desire to encourage Henry to complete the English Reformation landed her in hot water, however, and nearly cost her her life. She debated religion with Henry, who didn't take kindly to what he saw as being preached to by his consort. She kept illegal religious books in her chambers, and she made enemies of powerful men, including Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, and the Lord Chancellor Sir Thomas Wriothesley. In early 1546, they moved against her, and it looked for a time like they might successfully topple her. A warrant was drawn up for the Queen's arrest, but Catherine found out about it and quickly sought to mollify the king by telling him she had debated with him only to distract him from his ailments and to learn from him. When Wriothesley and his men came to arrest her the next day while she was walking in the royal gardens with Henry, he upbraided them and sent them away. Catherine was safe. Henry died on the 28th of January 1547, and upon discovering she was to have no role in the regency government for Edward VI, Catherine took the extraordinary step of a scandalously fast remarriage to her old flame, Edward's uncle Thomas Seymour. This fourth marriage occurred in secret in April or May 1547, and the pair set up home at Catherine's dower manors of Hanworth and Chelsea, where they were joined by her 13-year-old stepdaughter, Princess Elizabeth. It soon became clear that Seymour had an unhealthy interest in the girl, though, and while Catherine seems to have believed at first that his attentions were nothing more than paternal, by the spring of 1548, when she was pregnant with her first child, she had realised her mistake, and sent Elizabeth away to live with Lady Denny, who was the sister of the girl's governess, thus putting the teenager beyond Seymour's reach. Catherine herself moved to her husband's home, Windsor Castle, in mid-June, where she gave birth to a daughter Mary on the 30th of August. The Dowager Queen quickly came down with puerperal fever, however, and on the 5th of September she died at Sudley, where she was given a quick and, by royal standards, very quiet Protestant burial. Her body was disinterred multiple times in the late 18th and early 19th centuries and badly mutilated, but what's left of her is still buried at Sudley today. The only one of Henry's wives left alive was Anne of Cleves, and though Catherine Parr is often referred to as the survivor of Henry VIII, in actual fact I think that title is more appropriate for Anne. Though she expressed a desire to return to Cleves in later years and had some financial issues and disputes with Edward VI and later Mary I, on the whole she lived a quiet and peaceful life with her servants at her various homes. Her last great state appearance was at Mary's coronation banquet in September 1553, by which point she was the third person in the kingdom after the new Queen and Princess Elizabeth. She died at Chelsea Manor in London on the 16th of July 1557, aged 41, and was given a spectacular Catholic funeral and burial in Westminster Abbey on the orders of the Queen. Anne, by the way, was also Catholic, so this funeral was entirely appropriate for her religious beliefs and status. She is the only one of Henry's wives to be buried in this prestigious location, though her funeral monument is now quite tricky to see, thanks to the other monuments built up around it. The story of Henry's wives had finally reached its end, but before this video does the same, I did promise you back at the beginning that I would share with you which of the women is my favourite to learn about and who I think I'd get along with the best. The answer to the first question is Anne Boleyn. I think her rise and fall is one of the great enduring tragedies of history, and that she's endlessly fascinating. But she was also renowned for her sharp tongue, and I don't know that I would actually get along with her very well in person, at least not for long periods of time. Instead, I think it's Catherine Parr I'd most enjoy hanging out with, as she's always seemed more approachable and even-tempered to me, and probably more on my wavelength. But I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Which of the wives is your favourite to read about, and who do you think you'd get along best with? Remember that you can check me out on Patreon and Instagram too, the links are in the description box, and if you want more on the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, try one of these options next. Whatever you choose, please enjoy, and until next time, keep learning.